August 7th, 1942, 20,000 feet above Guadalcanal. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai's hand trembled slightly as he gripped the control stick of his Mitsubishi Zero, recording in his mind images that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The water seemed covered with vessels. I had never seen so large a convoy before, although I had flown on many occasions over Japanese troopship fleets during our invasion operations. Through the crystalline Pacific morning air, he witnessed something that contradicted everything his commanders had told him about American weakness. The convoy stretched from horizon to horizon, an armada of steel that defied comprehension. Dozens of warships, transports, cruisers, and destroyers formed a protective screen around the landing beaches. The sheer density of vessels made the ocean itself seem to disappear beneath grey hulls. In Japan, military propaganda had described America as a soft nation, weakened by luxury, divided by democracy, incapable of sustained industrial war. Yet here, 6,000 miles from San Francisco, lay an invasion fleet larger than anything Sakai had seen in 6 years of combat flying. The mathematics of Japanese defeat were being written not in tactical maneuvers, but in production capacity that would soon overwhelm every assumption these pilots carried about their enemy's capabilities. 54 Zeros and 27 bombers from the Tainan Air Group had departed Rabaul at dawn that morning. Their mission was to strike the American landing forces at Guadalcanal and Tulagi. But what Sakai saw below him was not a vulnerable landing operation that could be disrupted. It was industrial might made manifest, a demonstration of production capacity so overwhelming that it rendered Japanese numerical calculations meaningless. The transformation of understanding had begun 3 months earlier, on June 4, 1942, in the waters off Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, leading the second wave attack on Midway Island, had radioed back a message that changed everything. There is need for a second attack wave. His observation, based on the American air defenses remaining active, set in motion Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's fateful decision to rearm his reserve aircraft. But what Japanese commanders did not yet understand was that American industrial capacity meant losses could be replaced faster than they could inflict them. The Battle of Midway cost Japan 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, vessels that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. More critically, it cost the Imperial Japanese Navy over 300 experienced pilots, men whose training had taken years to complete. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, retired to his cabin after the battle and refused to see anyone for 3 days. When a subordinate wondered who would apologize to the Emperor for the defeat, Yamamoto answered simply, "Leave that to me. I am the only one who must apologize to His Majesty." But the true scope of the disaster was not yet apparent. Japanese leadership believed they could rebuild their carrier forces, train new pilots, and prepare for the decisive battle that would still deliver victory. What they failed to comprehend was the industrial equation that would make such recovery impossible. While Japan struggled to replace 4 carriers and 300 pilots, America was already building vessels and training aviators at a rate that would prove insurmountable. Saburo Sakai had been born in 1916 in Saga Prefecture into a family that traced its samurai ancestry back centuries. His path to the cockpit of a Zero fighter had been shaped by poverty and determination. After his father's death when Sakai was 11, he had enlisted in the Imperial Japanese Navy at age 16, enduring the brutal training regimen that transformed recruits into naval ratings. The beatings were severe. Stand tall to the wall. Bend down, recruit Sakai. I am not doing this because I hate you, but because I like you and want you to make a good seaman. In 1937, Sakai had been accepted into pilot training, graduating first in his class at Tsuchiura. Emperor Hirohito himself had presented him with a silver watch, an honor that marked him as elite among the elite. By 1938, he was flying combat missions over China in the Mitsubishi A-5M fighter, experiencing his first taste of aerial warfare. In 1940, he transitioned to the revolutionary new A-6M-0, an aircraft that would define Japanese air superiority in the war's opening months. The Zero was a masterpiece of engineering focused on a single principle, range and maneuverability at any cost. With an operational radius of over 500 nautical miles, it could escort bombers on missions that American intelligence analysts deemed impossible. Its legendary turning ability came from an airframe so light that American pilots initially could not believe such performance was achievable. Japanese designers had accomplished this by eliminating every possible gram of excess weight, including armor plating for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks. This design philosophy reflected a deeper strategic assumption. Japanese doctrine emphasized the offensive, the first strike, the aggressive pursuit of the enemy. Armor was for the defensive-minded. Self-sealing fuel tanks were for those who expected to be hit. The Zero pilot was trained to destroy the enemy before the enemy could shoot back. For the first 6 months of the war, this philosophy seemed vindicated by an unbroken string of victories. On December 8, 1941, Sakai flew one of 45 Zeros from the Tainan Air Group that attacked Clark Air Base in the Philippines. He shot down a Curtiss P-40 Warhawk in his first combat against Americans and destroyed 2 B-17 Flying Fortresses by strafing them on the ground. Over the following months, he flew missions over the Dutch East Indies, demonstrating the combat superiority that made the Zero feared throughout the Pacific. By the time of Guadalcanal, Sakai had accumulated over 3,000 hours of flight time and numerous aerial victories. The American landing at Guadalcanal on August 7th represented a fundamental shift in the Pacific War. For the first time, the United States was taking the offensive, seizing territory that Japan had captured in the war's opening months. The target was Henderson Field, an airstrip under construction that would give American forces a base from which to threaten Japanese positions throughout the Solomon Islands. Control of Guadalcanal meant control of the sea lanes to Australia. Loss of Guadalcanal meant the beginning of the end of Japan's defensive perimeter. As Sakai's formation approached Guadalcanal that morning, he pressed his face against the canopy, counting ships below. He stopped counting at 30, then 40, then 50. The vessels kept appearing, stretching to the limits of visibility. Transport ships unloading men and equipment, destroyers patrolling in protective screens, cruisers with their guns trained skyward. And somewhere among them, though not visible to Sakai at that moment, were the aircraft carriers that had launched the fighters, now rising to meet the Japanese attack. The combat that followed would become one of the most famous aerial engagements of the Pacific War. American F-4F Wildcats from the carriers Saratoga, Enterprise, and Wasp rose to intercept the Japanese formation. The Wildcats were inferior to the Zero in speed, climb rate, and maneuverability, but they possessed something the Zero lacked: armor, bulletproof windscreens, steel plating behind the pilot's seat, and self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb punishment without exploding into flames. Sakai engaged multiple Wildcats during the battle, confident in his superior aircraft and extensive training. He positioned his Zero behind one American fighter and opened fire with his 2 7.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. To his shock, the Wildcat absorbed the punishment and kept flying. The bullets seemed to have no effect. The American pilot maneuvered aggressively, refusing to go down despite taking hits that would have destroyed a Zero instantly. What Sakai was experiencing, though he did not yet have words for it, was the first manifestation of American industrial philosophy made flesh. The Wildcat was not designed to win dogfights through superior maneuverability. It was designed to absorb damage, protect its pilot, and rely on coordinated team tactics rather than individual skill. It was built with the assumption that the pilot was more valuable than the aircraft, because America could build replacement aircraft faster than it could train replacement pilots with thousands of hours of experience. During the engagement, Sakai made a critical error. He misidentified a formation of Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers as fighters and attacked from behind. The rear gunners opened fire, and a bullet struck Sakai in the head, destroying his right eye and paralyzing the left side of his body. Blood filled his cockpit, his vision blurred. By every reasonable expectation, he should have died within minutes. What happened next became one of aviation history's most remarkable survival stories. Despite catastrophic head wounds, partial blindness, and intermittent consciousness, Sakai flew his damaged Zero over 560 miles back to Rabaul. The 4-hour and 47-minute flight required him to repeatedly strike his own wounds to shock himself back to consciousness when he began to black out. The Zero's extreme range, the same characteristic that had made it so effective offensively, now saved his life by giving him just enough fuel to reach safety. Sakai's debriefing before he collapsed revealed crucial information about the American forces at Guadalcanal, but more importantly his observations about the size of the convoy and the unexpected resilience of American aircraft began filtering through Japanese command structures. The reports were initially dismissed as exaggerations born of combat stress and injury. No nation could project such force so far from its home bases. The Americans must have stripped their defenses elsewhere to gather such a fleet. It was unsustainable. But the reports kept coming from other pilots, other battles, other encounters with American forces. The Americans always had more ships, more planes, more pilots, and critically they always came back. Japanese pilots would shoot down American aircraft by the dozens, inflicting what seemed like decisive losses, only to find the next day's patrol facing the same numbers as before. The Allies seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of aircraft, Sakai would later write. A week never went by without the enemy suffering losses, yet his planes came, by 2 and 3s and by the dozens. The industrial reality behind these observations would have seemed impossible to Japanese commanders schooled in resource-limited warfare. While Japan was producing approximately 7,000 aircraft per year in 1942, American factories were already building over 47,000. By 1944, American aircraft production would reach 96,000 planes annually, while Japanese production peaked at 28,000. The United States was not just outproducing Japan, it was outproducing Japan, Germany, and Italy combined. The roots of this industrial disparity stretched back decades before the war began. America's automobile industry had pioneered mass production techniques that Japan had never fully adopted. The Ford Motor Company alone, having perfected the assembly line method before World War I, could apply those techniques to aircraft production with devastating efficiency. At Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, workers completed a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at peak production. The facility, which covered 67 acres under one roof, employed 42,000 workers operating 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. But it was not merely the size of American factories that created the production advantage. It was the systematic approach to manufacturing that treated aircraft as products rather than handcrafted artifacts. Boeing's production of the B-17 Flying Fortress increased from 60 aircraft per month in 1942 to 362 per month in 1944. This six-fold increase was achieved through continuous refinement of manufacturing processes, standardization of parts, and coordination between multiple factories producing components that could be assembled anywhere in the system. The Japanese aircraft industry, by contrast, remained rooted in artisanal manufacturing methods. Even at peak war production, Japanese factories relied heavily on skilled craftsmen hand-fitting components. Quality control focused on individual excellence rather than systematic standardization. This approach produced superb individual aircraft, but could never achieve the production volumes that mass manufacturing enabled. When American factories discovered production bottlenecks, they redesigned the manufacturing process. When Japanese factories encountered similar problems, they assigned more skilled workers to overcome them through individual effort. Japanese aircraft production faced multiple structural challenges that limited output regardless of worker dedication or skill. The lack of interchangeable parts meant that components from one factory often could not be used in aircraft assembled at another facility. This required maintaining separate supply chains and prevented the kind of distributed production that American industry employed so effectively. When bombing damaged a Japanese aircraft factory, production could not easily be shifted to undamaged facilities because the components were not standardized. Material shortages increasingly constrained Japanese production as the war progressed. Aluminum, essential for aircraft construction, became scarce as American submarines sank the cargo ships, bringing bauxite from Southeast Asian mines to Japanese refineries. Synthetic substitutes proved inferior in quality and more difficult to work with. High-quality steel for engines and critical components also grew scarce. By late 1944, some Japanese aircraft were being built with wooden components in place of metal ones, saving strategic materials but reducing performance and reliability. The Japanese aircraft industry also suffered from organizational fragmentation that prevented efficient resource allocation. The Imperial Army and Imperial Navy each operated separate aircraft development and production programs, often duplicating efforts and competing for scarce resources. Army and Navy aircraft used different engines, different weapons, even different fuel specifications, preventing economies of scale and complicating logistics. Attempts to rationalize production and create common standards repeatedly failed due to inter-service rivalry and bureaucratic inertia. Labor force issues further limited Japanese production. Unlike American factories, which drew heavily on women workers to replace men who had joined the military, Japanese industry remained reluctant to employ women in significant numbers, even as labor shortages grew acute. Cultural attitudes about appropriate roles for women meant that Japan failed to mobilize a significant portion of its potential workforce. The workers who were available often lacked adequate training, as skilled craftsmen were conscripted into military service and replaced by inexperienced laborers who required close supervision. Quality control. Problems increased as experienced workers left for military service and were replaced by hastily trained substitutes. Aircraft that had been meticulously assembled by skilled craftsmen before the war were increasingly produced by workers who had received only minimal training. Defect rates rose. Aircraft required more maintenance. Combat losses included planes that failed due to manufacturing defects rather than enemy action. The systematic approach to quality that characterized American mass production was absent from Japanese manufacturing, which relied on individual craftsmanship that could not be easily replicated or scaled. The human dimension of this industrial disparity was equally telling. American pilot training programs produced approximately 8,000 new naval aviators per month by 1944. These pilots received extensive training, typically 18 months of flight school, with over 500 hours of flying time before entering combat. The training pipeline stretched from pre-flight school through primary training, intermediate training, and advanced training, each stage building systematically on the previous one. Students learned not just how to fly aircraft, but how to navigate by instruments, how to operate as part of formations, how to communicate effectively with ground controllers and other pilots, and how to employ weapons systems effectively. American training philosophy emphasized building large numbers of competent pilots rather than producing a small elite of exceptional aviators. This approach reflected industrial thinking applied to human capital development. Just as American factories used standardized processes to build large numbers of reliable aircraft rather than handcrafting a few exceptional machines, American training produced large numbers of reliable pilots rather than focusing exclusively on developing a small number of elite performers. The system worked because it matched industrial capacity with human resource development, ensuring that the aircraft rolling off assembly lines had trained crews ready to fly them. Training facilities themselves represented significant industrial investments. The United States established dozens of flight training bases across the country, many in areas with favorable weather that allowed year-round flying. These bases included not just runways and hangars, but complete support infrastructure, maintenance facilities, housing for instructors and students, classrooms equipped with the latest training aids, and even link trainers, primitive flight simulators that allowed students to practice instruments, procedures, without using expensive flight hours or risking aircraft. The fuel allocated to American training programs alone exceeded total Japanese aviation fuel consumption in many months. American student pilots could afford to make mistakes, to practice difficult maneuvers repeatedly, to build experience gradually under supervised conditions. They flew training missions in aircraft that, while often obsolete for combat, were well maintained and adequately supplied with fuel and spare parts. By the time they reached fleet squadrons, American pilots had internalized procedures and developed reflexes through hundreds of hours of practice. By contrast, Japanese pilot training programs, which had produced the world's most skilled aviators before the war, collapsed under the strain of attempting to replace combat losses while simultaneously expanding the Air Force. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, an instructor at the Yokosuka Naval Air Training Command, documented the decline with growing alarm. Before the war, candidates for pilot training competed intensely for limited slots. Out of 1,500 sailors who applied for the pilot trainee system in 1937, only 70 were accepted and 25 graduated. The training lasted over 3 years and emphasized not just flying skills but tactical doctrine, navigation, and combat theory. Graduates emerged as highly competent aviators capable of complex missions. By 1943, the pressure to replace lost